boys and girls. So today we're going to look at a Pro Flange crank from CB Performance. This is absolutely probably the cheapest flanged crank that you can buy right now. I think currently, as I talk, the website says like $410 for a crank. The next cheapest one you can find is going to be a Bug Pack or Impy flange crank. I think Carcraft had it. Last I looked, it was almost $600. So what is a flanged crank? Well, it's to do with this area right back here. And most people don't understand what is different here about it than a stock bug crank. So let's look at a little drawing. I am not Michelangelo, so bear with me. All right, so your stock crank should be on this end. The end part where the flywheel attaches has little dowel pins. I didn't draw those here. They usually have 4 dowel pins and a big bolt that goes basically through here and tightens the flywheel on. The surfaces here go over each other. They slide over, and there's usually an O-ring, or some of the early ones had a gasket that went in there to seal up the back area from pressure coming out. And your flywheel seal rides on the flywheel, obviously. Well, that's okay and fine and dandy. They'll hold, I think really about the suggested limit is about 80-ish horsepower with 4 dowels. Then you can go to what they call an 8 dowel crank, where it's the same setup, but they add 4 more dowel pins. They just drill with a fixture through the flywheel and through the crank to add more dowel pins, and hence adds more strength to hold it. Alright, so now that we talked about basically what an 8 dowel crank is and the stock style, the next thing you can do is, because there is a limit with 8 dowels. You know, some people basically say $150, some people say $200, but there is eventually going to be a point where it doesn't hold anymore. So then your next option to go to is what they call a wedge-mated crank. And what that is it's an 8 dowel crank that the inside surface of the flywheel has been welded, and a taper has been ground on the very back side of the crankshaft, and a corresponding taper on the other side into the flywheel. And it's an interference taper, so you know this has a slight mismatch of like usually about 1 or 2 degrees or something like that to make it wedge to each other when you tighten them down. The problem here that you'll run into is you can only take this flywheel on and off so many times before you eventually destroy this wedge fit. All right, so it's not like you want to keep pulling the flywheel off for silly things. The second thing is this flywheel and this crank is mated together. All right, this taper and this taper may be completely different from the next set of cranks that the guy does. All right, so a crank shop has to do it. If you burn a flywheel on this setup, you can't just buy a flywheel that fits that taper. You're going to have to take the motor apart, pull your crank out, send it back to the shop that does wedge mating, and have them re-wedge mate the new flywheel to the crankshaft. Unless for some reason somehow the shop you got it from is doing it all CNC and they know exactly the exact taper and all that, and all of them are the same. Most of them are not. All right, so a way around this problem here is, in drag racing, you can burn clutches and burn flywheels and all that stuff and still have a good crank. Or you could burn a rod journal and need to take this all, get apart, and that's destroying the taper fit and keep taking it apart. The solution to all that is a flange crank. So this is like any other American-made car, any other car, is it has a big, huge flange hanging off the back here that uses bolts and dowel pins to locate it. So on this particular one, there are 6 bolts and there are 6 dowel pins that locate the flywheel. The flywheel can be taken off, put on, taken off, put on, changed out for another one. As long as everything's been balanced to themselves, you can just take it off and move it to the next one. If you ever burn the flywheel up, burn the clutch, burn the flywheel, you can take this off and just throw it away and get another $270 flywheel, bolt it back on, and you're good to go. You do not have to take your motor apart. And that's what sold this on to me years ago, is a gentleman that was our local area performance shop, drag racing shop, and he was urging people back when Bugpack first came out with their crank in their late mid-2000s that if they're going to build a motor, the smart money is to build a flange crank motor. And I asked him why, and he told me with just the best idea is, you know, with this setup, we burn a clutch out. We're trying to drive on the street, trying to drive at the drag strip. You burn the clutch out, you burn the flywheel up. You can take the flywheel off. You might be able to get it machined, but if you can't, you can just throw this one away and put a new one on. With this setup, if we burn the flywheel up and it can't be machined, we're taking the motor apart to take this crank out to have a new flywheel mated to it. Because back then, we didn't have CNC machines and all that at every disposal. Maybe that's slightly different now, I don't know. But that made smart money sense to me. Like, hey, I don't want to take my motor apart if it's perfectly good. The second thing here is usually, unless you go for a very high-end crank, you're going to have Volkswagen journals all the way through and might have Chevy journals for the rods. And what happens is your overlap on an 86 stroke with Chevy journals on your main bearings here gets more and more smaller. All right? Because if this is a Volkswagen rod journal, which would be 55 millimeters, and the main journal is 55 millimeters, there's a certain amount of overlap, and you keep moving the stroke out, you end up losing your overlap. And then you smaller that journal down to a 50 mil type Chevy type journal, and that even makes it smaller. This crank comes with 60 millimeter Type 4 main journals. All right, so these are 5 millimeters bigger, 2 millimeters on each side. That adds back 2.5 millimeters of overlap on my already really small area there. You can see there's not very much already. So if this was a bug journal, Type 1, I'd be missing 2.5 more millimeters of my overlap. So there's still cost associated with this. Even though the crank is pretty cheap, it's in range of other 86 millimeter 8 dowel cranks. The thing is bearings. So this takes a special set of bearings that do not require the case to get boarded out. The other cranks that most people sell usually used to have to bore them whole, line bore the whole case and get Type 4 mains bearings throughout. This one takes a smaller bearing, an adapter bearing. But the problem with that is you have to have their split bearings on these two journals, and you have to get the case machined for the tangs. All right. You also have to get your case machined for a much larger flywheel seal, because this is about the size that the flywheel seal is on a standard bug. All right. Setting up in play is not done with shims anymore. It's set up by your bearings. So there are disadvantages to this, and that all backtracks to cost. Even though this crank is cheaper, like I say, it's still a $275 flywheel. The bearings were like $250, and it was another $100 to have the seal machined, and it was another $100 to have the tangs machined. All right, so you're still adding a lot of cost, but it's fairly equivalent to a wedge-mated crank, which currently is around $700 to $800 for a whole assembly. So it's not too far off from that. But I do like the idea, if I ever have a problem with my clutch, my flywheel, it's all removable. Just like any V8 car, American-made car, any Japanese car, you know, you're finally moving to a setup like, hey, I messed my flywheel up, it's imbalanced, whatever, just take it off, put another one on, we're ready to go. We're not pulling a motor apart to have the taper redone on the crankshaft. And also, you can pull the flywheel off 100 times if you want, and it's not going to change the taper. You're not going to ruin it. So anyways, boys and girls, this is going to go in our build for our 2286, our 92 millimeter bore by 86 stroke. We are collecting parts right now. This is it from CB Performance. They did not pay me any money. I paid them lots of money for this. All right. And it is made in China, as with all the other cranks that are out there pretty much right now, unless you buy something really, really fancy for like $2,000. So anyways, boys and girls, hopefully this answers some questions. What's the difference between a flange crank, a standard 8 dowel crank, and a wedge-mated crank? So get out there, get your projects going. Let's get these things together, and stay tuned for the rest of the build on this. We're going to have more videos of the parts that are going into it and why I chose them. And I will give you a cost on most of the parts, but costs don't really matter because they change daily nowadays. So I'll see you guys later. Get out there and get your projects done.